The last of the autumn light bled through the tall, mullioned windows of Thorncroft, painting long, mournful stripes across the worn Aubusson carpet. Ilara Thorne stood before the hearth, where no fire burned, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white, sharp points against the grey of her dress. The chill in the room was not merely from the October air. It was the cold of finality, of a world contracting to a single, unbearable point. Before her, on the mantelpiece, sat a stack of letters, each a paper tombstone for her family's name, debts, creditors. The words swam before her eyes, a tide of ink threatening to pull her under. Her father, a man who had loved the thrill of the cards more than the security of his own daughter, was a ghost in this house now, confined to his study with a bottle of brandy and the spectre of his ruin. It was Ilara who had to face the solicitor, his face a mask of practiced pity. It was Ilara who had to listen to the whispers in the village, the sideways glances that felt like tiny, sharp stones against her skin. Thorncroft, the house that had held 6 generations of her family within its honey-toned stone walls, would be gone by Christmas, and she, at 22, would be cast out with it, a penniless noblewoman with nothing but a tarnished name. There was one offer, one solitary, bizarre lifeline thrown from an unimaginable height. It had come not through a hopeful society matchmaker, but through a grim-faced man of law, representing a client whose name was spoken only in hushed, speculative tones, Alistair Vance, the Duke of Blackwood. The Black Duke, they called him, a recluse since the tragic death of his young wife 4 years prior. He was a man of immense wealth and influence who had simply vanished from the world. He lived entombed in his sprawling northern estate, a fortress of grief from which no laughter was ever heard. The offer was not for a governess nor a companion. It was an offer of marriage, a contract, the solicitor had called it, his gaze clinical. The Duke required a wife, not for love, not for passion, but for a purpose as cold and practical as the terms he had laid out. He needed a respectable lady to act as chatelaine for his estate, and, most importantly, as a mother to his young daughter, who had been left without one. In return, every one of her father's debts would be settled, Thorncroft would be saved, and she would be provided for the rest of her life. It was a devil's bargain, a trade of her future for her past. But what future did she have? A slow, grinding descent into poverty and obscurity. She had accepted the summons to his London townhouse with a heart like a stone in her chest. The house on Belgrave Square was a monolith of white stone and black iron, as forbidding as its owner's reputation. Inside, the air was still and cold, smelling of beeswax and something else, something like disuse. A footman with a face devoid of expression led her into a library where the books on the shelves seemed to hold their breath, and then he entered. The Duke of Blackwood was taller than she had imagined, a man carved from shadow and granite. His hair was the black of a raven's wing, his jaw sharp and uncompromising. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter storm, a deep, turbulent gray, and they were utterly, terrifyingly empty. They looked at her not as a woman or even a person, but as a problem to be solved, an acquisition to be catalogued. He did not offer her a seat. He did not offer a pleasantry. He stood across the vast expanse of a mahogany desk, his hands clasped behind his back, a portrait of severe, remote power. "Miss Thorne," he began, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the light in the room, "I trust my solicitor has made the fundamentals of my proposal clear." Ilara found her voice, a small, steady thing in the oppressive silence. "He has, Your Grace." "Good. I have no desire for misunderstanding or sentiment. Let me be perfectly clear about the nature of our arrangement, should you choose to accept." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, an assessment so detached it made her feel like a piece of furniture. "I require a wife to manage my household, to serve as a hostess when duty requires, and to provide a stable maternal presence for my daughter Lillian. She is 5. A flicker of something, pity perhaps, stirred in Ilara's chest for the unknown child. To have this man for a father. "In exchange," he continued, his voice unwavering, "I will see your family's debts erased and your ancestral home secured. You will have a generous allowance and want for nothing in the material sense. Your duties will be clearly defined. Our lives will be conducted with civility and discretion. They will be entirely separate." Ilara's throat felt tight. She had expected coldness, but the sheer brutal transaction of it was still a shock. He was purchasing a warden for his home, a governess for his child, and cloaking it in the legitimacy of a marriage vow. I understand," she managed to say. He took a step closer, and the air around him seemed to grow colder still. He stopped before the desk, his gaze boring into hers, and delivered the final, cruelest term. "There is one more thing, Miss Thorne, a stipulation of the utmost importance." His voice dropped, losing none of its steel. "You will be my wife in name and in the eyes of the law. You will be mistress of Blackwood Manor, but you will never be a duchess." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as shards of ice. Ilara stared at him, bewildered. "Your Grace, the title of Duchess of Blackwood died with my late wife. It will not be resurrected. You will not use it. You will not be addressed by it. The staff will be instructed. Society, should we have cause to interact with it, will be made to understand. You will be Lady Ilara Vance. Nothing more. Is that understood?" It was a negation, a public and private stripping of the very status for which she was being acquired. He was not just marrying her, he was branding her as an impostor from the outset. It was a humiliation designed to keep her in her place, a constant living reminder that she was a substitute, a functionary, not a partner. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it stole her breath. Why go to such lengths? Her pride, the last tattered remnant of her Thorn heritage, screamed at her to refuse, to turn and walk out of this mausoleum of a house and take her chances with the bailiffs and the whispers. But then the image of Thorncroft returned, the soft morning light in the gallery, the scent of roses from the garden her mother had planted, the weight of generations in its very stones. She thought of her father, broken and lost. She could not let it all turn to dust. She lifted her chin, meeting that glacial gaze with a resolve she did not feel. Her own voice, when it came, was clear and cold, a perfect echo of his own. "Perfectly, Your Grace," she said. "I understand the terms." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes, so fleeting she might have imagined it. He gave a single sharp nod. "Very well, the arrangements will be made. The wedding will be a private affair here in 1 week's time. You will then remove to Blackwood Manor. I trust you will be ready." He turned away, a clear dismissal. The audience was over. The contract was sealed. She had sold her name, her future, her very identity, for the stones and mortar of a house. As she walked out of the library, the chill of his presence followed her, a premonition of the long, cold years that stretched before her, a life lived in the shadow of a ghost, beside a man made of ice. She would be a wife, but not a wife, a lady, but never a duchess. The journey north was a passage from one world to another. The rolling, gentle hills of the south gave way to a landscape that grew wilder, more dramatic with every mile. The sky seemed larger, a vast, bruised canvas of grey and purple clouds that pressed down upon the moors. Blackwood Manor appeared suddenly, a dark ship of stone breasting a wave of ancient forest. It was a place of stark, Gothic beauty, all sharp angles and towering chimneys, its granite walls stained dark by centuries of wind and rain. It did not look like a home, it looked like a fortress, built to keep the world at bay. Ilara stepped out of the carriage, the wind whipping at her traveling cloak, and felt the oppressive weight of the place settle upon her. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. A line of servants stood waiting on the grand stone steps, their faces impassive, their postures rigid. At their head was a woman in her late 50s, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun, her black dress immaculate. She stepped forward and gave a slight curtsy. "My lady," she said, her voice crisp and professional, "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Welcome to Blackwood Manor." There was no warmth in the greeting, only a correct and formal acknowledgement. The Duke was not there to meet her. He had travelled ahead, and the emptiness of the welcome felt like another deliberate slight, another reminder of her status. She was not a bride arriving at her new home. She was a new employee, arriving to begin her duties. Mrs. Gable led her inside. The great hall was cavernous, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, but its heat did not seem to penetrate the chill that clung to the stone. Suits of armor stood like silent, empty sentinels along the walls, and a massive, age-darkened portrait of a grim-faced ancestor scowled down from above the mantel. Everything was immaculate, polished to a high gleam, but it was the cleanliness of a museum, not a home. There was no clutter, no sign of life, no stray book or forgotten shawl. It was a house holding its breath. "His Grace is in his study and does not wish to be disturbed," Mrs. Gable announced, as if sensing Ilara's question. "He has instructed me to show you to your rooms. They are in the East Wing." The distinction was not lost on Ilara, the East Wing. As far as possible, she presumed, from his own. The rooms were magnificent. A sitting room, a bedroom, a dressing room, all beautifully appointed with fine furniture, heavy silk curtains, and a canopied bed that could have slept a family. But, like the rest of the house, they were sterile, impersonal. It was clear that no one had lived in them for a very long time. There were no personal trinkets, no pictures, no sign that anyone had ever laughed or wept within these walls. A fire had been laid in the hearth, its flames the only spot of cheerful color in the sea of muted greys and blues. "Your things will be brought up, my lady," Mrs. Gable said, her hands clasped before her. "Dinner is at 8. His Grace will expect you in the main dining hall." She paused, a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation. The young Mistress Lillian has her supper in the nursery. I see, Ilara said quietly. May I meet her? Mrs. Gable's expression tightened. His Grace prefers her routine not be disturbed, perhaps tomorrow. It was a polite but firm refusal. Left alone, Ilara walked to the window. It overlooked a vast formal garden, its geometric patterns stark and bare in the late autumn light. Beyond it, the dark line of the forest began, and to the west she could see another wing of the house, its windows dark and lifeless. The west wing, a strange unbidden shiver traced its way down her spine. There was a finality to the darkness of those windows, a sense of deliberate abandonment. The first dinner was an exercise in silent endurance. The dining hall was a place of baronial splendor, with a table long enough to seat 40. They sat at opposite ends, two small, solitary figures separated by an acre of polished mahogany. The only sounds were the soft footsteps of the footman and the clink of silver on porcelain. Alistair did not look at her. He ate with a mechanical precision, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. He was a perfect, beautiful, and utterly inaccessible statue. Ilara found herself studying him, trying to find a crack in the marble facade. She noted the fine lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of something more than his 30 years. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hand rested on the table, not relaxed but coiled, as if ready to clench into a fist. This was not a man at peace. This was a man at war with himself, and he had made his home a fortress to contain the battle. She tried to start a conversation once, a simple comment about the stark beauty of the landscape. He looked at her then, his grey eyes flat and cold. "It is what it is, madam," he said, and the words were a wall, high and impenetrable. She did not try again. The days that followed fell into a rigid, chilling routine. She would wake, breakfast alone in her rooms, and then wander the silent, echoing corridors of the East Wing. She took her meals alone, unless it was dinner, which was always the same silent, strained affair with the Duke. She was a ghost in her own home, a prisoner in a gilded cage. She finally met Lillian on the third day. She found the nursery herself, a large, airy room at the top of the house. The child was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a legion of untouched porcelain dolls, her small face serious as she meticulously arranged a set of wooden blocks into a perfect, uninspired tower. She had her father's black hair, but her eyes were a startlingly deep blue. She looked up as Ilara entered, her expression not of curiosity but of mild alarm, as if an unexpected piece of furniture had suddenly appeared in her room. A young, nervous-looking nanny scurried forward. "My lady, I wasn't expecting—" "It's quite all right," Ilara said, her voice gentle. She knelt down, keeping a respectful distance from the child. "Hello, Lillian. I am Ilara." Lillian said nothing. She simply stared, her blue eyes wide and solemn. She did not look like a happy child. She looked like a miniature version of her father, self-contained, watchful, and deeply solitary. Ilara tried over the next few days to breach the child's silence. She brought her a picture book. Lillian glanced at it and then returned to her blocks. She asked her about her dolls. Lillian pointed to one and whispered, "That is Annabelle," before falling silent again. She was a child who had learned not to expect engagement, not to ask for attention. It broke Ilara's heart. The house itself was a labyrinth of secrets. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, their faces trained to betray nothing. They were polite, calling her "my lady" with the correct deference, but there was a distance in their eyes. She was an outsider, an interloper, and always there was the West Wing. No one ever went there. The corridor leading to it was blocked by a heavy velvet rope, and a fine layer of dust coated the floor beyond it. When she asked Mrs. Gable what was in that wing, the housekeeper's face had become a stony mask. "The Duchess's rooms, my lady," she had said, her voice clipped. "His Grace has ordered them closed." The Duchess, Eleonora, her name was a palpable presence in the house, a lingering perfume of memory that clung to everything. Her portrait hung in the long gallery, a beautiful ethereal woman with sad, dark eyes and a tragic smile. She was the saint of Blackwood Manor, and Ilara was the usurper. The staff's loyalty, the Duke's grief, the child's silence, it all belonged to her. One afternoon, seeking an escape from the oppressive silence of the house, Ilara found a small, rusted iron door half hidden behind an overgrown yew hedge at the edge of the formal gardens. Her curiosity piqued. She worked the stiff handle until it finally groaned open. She stepped inside and gasped. It was a conservatory, or what was left of one, a vast structure of glass and iron. It must have once been a place of breathtaking beauty, but now it was a tomb. The glass was clouded with grime and cracked in several places, the ironwork was rusted, and the stone floor was covered in a carpet of dead leaves and dirt. The plants within were a skeletal army of neglect. Dead vines, thick as a man's wrist, clawed at the glass panes, blocking out what little light there was. The desiccated corpses of exotic ferns and flowers lay in their terracotta pots, their brown, brittle leaves rustling in the draughts that snaked through the broken panes. Yet, in the very center of the devastation, a single miraculous spot of color remained. A camellia bush, ancient and gnarled, had somehow survived. Against all odds, it had produced a handful of perfect, waxy white blossoms, their pristine beauty a stark rebellion against the decay that surrounded them. Ilara walked deeper into the conservatory, her footsteps crunching on the debris. She touched one of the camellia blossoms, its petals cool and smooth as silk. In that moment, standing in the midst of all that death and neglect, with that one small defiant spark of life, Ilara felt a strange sense of kinship. This place was a mirror of her own life here, of the entire house. A beautiful structure left to decay in the shadow of a great sorrow. An idea began to form in her mind, a tiny seed of purpose in the barren soil of her days. She would bring this place back to life. It would be hers. A place where she could cultivate beauty, where she could make something grow. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion, a way to claim a piece of this cold, unwelcoming world for herself. She knew she would need the Duke's permission. The thought of facing him, of asking for something, filled her with a familiar dread. But the image of the white camellias, so brave and so alone, gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. That evening at dinner, as the silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, she cleared her throat. Alistair looked up, his expression one of faint annoyance at the interruption. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady, "I discovered the old conservatory at the edge of the gardens today." His eyes narrowed slightly. "It has not been used in years." "I know, it is in a state of terrible neglect," she said, pressing on. "I was wondering, I have some knowledge of botany. My mother taught me. With your permission, of course, I should like to try and restore it." He stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. She expected a curt refusal, a dismissal of her whim. She braced herself for the cold wall of his indifference. Instead, he slowly placed his fork down. He looked not at her, but at the portrait of his ancestor over the hearth. "The conservatory was my wife's," he said, and the name, though unspoken, hung between them. "She loved it." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. Ilara's heart sank. Of course, it was another shrine to the sainted Eleonora. She had trespassed on sacred ground. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I did not know. I will not go there again." He was silent for so long that she thought the conversation was over. But then he looked back at her, and his gaze was strange, analytical. "Why?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. "Why do I wish to restore it?" "Yes," she thought for a moment, choosing her words with care. "Because it is a shame to see something so beautiful be allowed to die," she said simply. "And because I should like to have something to do." The honesty of her answer seemed to resonate in the silent room. He picked up his wine glass, studying the dark red liquid within. "Very well," he said, his voice so low she almost missed it. "Do as you wish. Instruct Mrs. Gable to provide you with whatever gardeners or supplies you require." And with that he returned to his meal. The wall was back in place, but a small, almost invisible crack had appeared in its surface. He had not only granted her request, he had given her a piece of his wife's memory to tend. She did not know if it was a test or a surrender, but as she left the dining hall that night for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, Ilara felt the faintest glimmer of something that was not despair. It felt astonishingly like hope. The work became her salvation. Each morning, Ilara would change into a sturdy old dress, and armed with shears and gloves, she would enter her broken kingdom of glass. The first week was a brutal physical battle against the decay. With the help of two bewildered but obedient young gardeners, she began the great clearing. They tore down the dead, choking vines, their woody carcasses leaving ghostly patterns on the grimy glass. They swept away years of accumulated leaves and dirt, carried out hundreds of pots filled with the dry bones of dead plants, the air filled with the scent of dust and damp earth, the scent of a tomb being disturbed. Throughout it all, Ilara worked with a fierce, focused energy. The physical exertion was a relief, a way to channel the frustration and loneliness that gnawed at her during the long, silent evenings. Her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and stained with earth. She felt a deep, satisfying ache in her muscles at the end of each day. She was not just cleaning a conservatory, she was carving out a space for herself, imposing order on chaos. Lillian began to watch her. At first she would stand at the nursery window, a small, still figure observing the activity below. Then, one day, her nanny brought her down to the edge of the formal gardens. The child stood 20 paces from the conservatory door, her hands clutching her nanny's skirt, her wide blue eyes following Ilara's every move. She never spoke, never came closer, but she was there, a silent daily witness. Ilara did not press her. She would simply smile in the child's direction, a small, gentle acknowledgement, and then return to her work. She knew that with a creature as timid and fragile as Lillian, patience was the only tool that would work. One afternoon, as Ilara was carefully scrubbing the grime from a pane of glass, she saw Lillian take a few hesitant steps away from her nanny toward the open door of the conservatory. The child paused, her small face a mixture of fear and fascination. Ilara stopped what she was doing and sat down on an overturned crate, making herself smaller, less intimidating. "It's very messy in here, isn't it?" Ilara said, her voice soft. Lillian gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She took another step, then another, until she was standing just inside the doorway, a small silhouette against the bright gray light. "I am hoping to make it beautiful again," Ilara continued, as if speaking to herself. "I think there were once flowers here of every color imaginable." Lillian's gaze traveled around the cavernous, half-cleared space. Her eyes, so like her father's in their solemnity, seemed to be trying to imagine it. "Mama liked flowers," she whispered. The words were so quiet, they were almost lost in the vastness of the room. It was the most she had ever said to Ilara. Ilara's heart ached. "Yes," she said gently, "I believe she did." From that day on, Lillian's visits grew longer. She would venture inside, perching on a crate just as Ilara had done, and watch her work. She began to ask quiet questions. "What was that one called?" she would ask, pointing to a dusty, empty pot. Ilara, who had found a collection of old, faded labels, would tell her. "Heliotrope," she might say. "It smells of vanilla and cherries." The day the new panes of glass arrived was a day of transformation. As the glaziers replaced the cracked and broken sections, sunlight, clean and unfiltered, poured into the conservatory for the first time in years. It illuminated the space, chasing the shadows from the corners and revealing the elegant, sweeping lines of the ironwork. It felt like a resurrection. Ilara had ordered sacks of fresh soil, new pots, and carefully selected seeds and seedlings. She began the slow, patient work of replanting. She chose hardy, resilient flowers first: lavender, rosemary, geraniums. Plants that could withstand a little neglect, that were known for their fortitude. One afternoon, she was showing Lillian how to gently loosen the roots of a small lavender plant before placing it in a new pot. The child's small fingers were clumsy but careful, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scent of lavender and damp earth filled the air. A shadow fell over them. Ilara looked up and her breath caught in her throat. Alistair stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light. His face was, as always, an unreadable mask, but his eyes were fixed on the sight of his daughter's hands, covered in soil, working alongside Ilara's. Lillian froze, her hand hovering over the plant, her face instantly losing its animation. She looked like a startled fawn, ready to bolt. Ilara kept her own movements slow and calm. "Hello, Your Grace," she said quietly. "Lillian is helping me." Alistair did not speak for a long moment. He stepped into the conservatory, his polished boots silent on the newly swept flagstones. He looked around, taking in the clean glass, the orderly rows of new pots, the piles of rich, dark soil. His gaze lingered on the ancient camellia bush, which seemed to stand taller and prouder now that it was no longer surrounded by death. He stopped beside the workbench where they were working. He looked down at the lavender plant, then at his daughter. Lillian shrank back slightly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Her hands are dirty," he said. His voice was flat, an observation without inflection. Ilara felt a surge of protectiveness. "It's only soil, Your Grace. It washes off." She met his gaze directly, her own calm and steady. "She is learning how things grow." He looked from Ilara to Lillian and back again. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. Ilara expected a reprimand, an order for Lillian to be returned to the nursery, to her sterile dolls, and her solitude. Instead, he reached out a gloved hand and touched a leaf of the lavender plant, his gesture surprisingly gentle. "The air in here," he said, his voice quiet, "is cleaner." It was not praise, it was not an expression of warmth, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a recognition of the change she had wrought. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Ilara with a rapidly beating heart. He had seen them together, seen his daughter engaged and alive in a way Ilara had never witnessed before, and he had not put a stop to it. It was the first sign of a thaw, a tiny fissure in the glacier of his grief. As she watched his retreating back, Ilara allowed herself to feel the warmth of the new sun on her skin. She looked down at Lillian, who was now staring after her father with a look of profound, childish wonder. Ilara gave the little girl's shoulder a gentle squeeze, and for the first time, Lillian did not pull away. The change, subtle at first, began to ripple through the house. It started with the flowers. As the conservatory came back to life, Ilara began to cut small bouquets, sprigs of lavender, a few hardy winter roses, the first of the jasmine, and place them in the rooms she inhabited. A small vase on her bedside table, a larger one in her sitting room. It was another quiet act of reclamation, of breathing life into the sterile spaces. Mrs. Gable watched this with a hawk's eye, her expression unreadable. Ilara expected a reminder that His Grace preferred things a certain way, that frivolities were not encouraged, but the reprimand never came. One morning, Ilara came downstairs to find that a footman had placed one of her small arrangements of rosemary and white heather on a table in the main hall. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a seismic shift. The staff was beginning to see her not as a temporary functionary, but as the mistress of the house. Her bond with Lillian deepened with each passing day. The conservatory was their sanctuary. They planted seeds together, their heads bent in shared concentration over the small pots. Ilara would tell her stories as they worked, tales of brave princesses who rescued themselves and clever girls who outsmarted goblins. Lillian, in turn, began to open up, her quiet whispers growing into full sentences. She told Ilara the names of all her dolls, what she dreamed about, that she was afraid of the dark. She started to laugh, a sound as rare and precious as the winter-blooming jasmine, a sound that Ilara was certain had not been heard within these walls for a very long time. Alistair remained a distant, enigmatic presence, but Ilara began to notice small changes in his behavior. He started to look at her during their silent dinners, his gaze no longer flat and dismissive, but analytical, as if he were seeing her for the first time. On 2 separate occasions, he did not retreat to his study immediately after the meal, but remained at the table, nursing a glass of port while she finished her tea. They did not speak, but the shared silence felt different, less like a void and more like a space waiting to be filled. The first frost of winter had silvered the lawns, and the peace of Blackwood Manor was about to be shattered. A letter arrived on a silver tray, the envelope thick and creamy, the handwriting an elegant, aggressive slant. It was from Lady Isolde Beaumont, the sister of the late Duchess Eleonora. She was arriving for an extended visit. Mrs. Gable's face, when Ilara informed her, was a study in controlled displeasure. "Lady Isolde," she said, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Of course, she considers this house her own." Isolde arrived like a tempest, a whirlwind of expensive French perfume, rustling silk and imperious commands. She was beautiful, in the same dark, tragic way as her sister in the portrait, but where Eleonora's eyes were sad, Isolde's were sharp and possessive. She swept into the great hall, stripping off her gloves, and greeted Ilara not with a handshake, but with a critical, head-to-toe inspection. "So you are the new arrangement," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She did not wait for an answer, turning instead to embrace Alistair, who had emerged from his study to greet her. The embrace was overly familiar, her hands lingering on his shoulders. "Alistair, darling, you look dreadful, utterly worn to the bone. This northern air does not agree with you." She immediately took charge of Lillian, scooping the child into her arms and showering her with cloying kisses, ignoring the way the little girl stiffened at the sudden overwhelming attention. "My darling Lillian, your auntie is here. Has this woman been taking adequate care of you?" she asked, shooting a venomous glance at Ilara over the child's head. From that moment, Isolde's presence was a corrosive acid, eating away at the fragile peace Ilara had so carefully cultivated. She treated Ilara like a servant, issuing orders, countermanding her instructions to the staff, and making pointed remarks at every opportunity. She filled the house with memories of Eleonora, her voice a constant cloying refrain. "Oh, Eleonora adored this particular vintage," she would say at dinner. "Eleonora arranged the flowers in such a more artistic fashion. Eleonora would never have allowed the child to get her frock so dirty." Each comment was a carefully aimed dart, designed to remind Ilara of her place as the usurper, the pale imitation. The staff grew tense, caught between their new mistress and the woman who represented the old regime. Lillian retreated into her shell, becoming once again the silent, watchful child Ilara had first met. The conservatory became Isolde's primary target. She walked into it one afternoon, her silk dress trailing on the stone floor, and surveyed the burgeoning life with a look of theatrical horror. "My heavens," she gasped. "What have you done to this place? You've filled it with such common things, lavender, geraniums. Alistair, darling, you can't allow this. This was Eleonora's sanctuary. She had orchids, rare, beautiful things. This is a travesty, an erasure of her memory." Ilara, who was potting a small rose cutting with Lillian, stood up, her hands covered in soil. "The orchids died, Lady Isolde," she said, her voice level. "Everything in here was dead. I am bringing it back to life." "With cottage flowers?" Isolde scoffed. "It's an insult." The tension in the house grew taut, a string stretched to the breaking point. The breaking point came, as it so often does, not with a shout, but with a child's fever. Lillian fell ill in the night. Ilara was woken by the frantic tapping of the child's nanny at her door. She found Lillian flushed and shivering in her bed, her breathing shallow, her small body radiating a frightening heat. Ilara immediately sent a groom for the doctor in the village, though she knew it would be hours before he could arrive. She bathed the child's forehead with cool cloths and held her small hand, murmuring soothing words. Isolde swept into the room like a fury. "What is going on, my poor darling?" she cried, rushing to the bedside. She immediately began to issue a flurry of contradictory orders, demanding more blankets, then fewer blankets, calling for hot bricks and then for the windows to be thrown open to the icy night air. Her panic was a disruptive, useless force in the quiet room. "It's this drafty, horrid house," she declared, glaring at Ilara, "and letting her play in that damp, dirty glass house. I knew it would make her ill. You have been utterly negligent." Alistair arrived, drawn by the commotion. He stood in the doorway, his face pale and grim in the lamplight. His gaze went first to his daughter, a flicker of raw fear in his eyes, then to the scene before him. Isolde, fluttering and hysterical. Ilara, calm and focused, gently sponging Lillian's face. "The doctor has been sent for," Ilara said, looking at him. Her voice was a steady anchor in the storm of Isolde's panic. "He'll take an age," Isolde wailed. "We must do something." Ilara ignored her. She remembered the remedies her own mother had used, the simple, gentle wisdom of the countryside. "Mrs. Gable," she said to the housekeeper, who had appeared behind the Duke, "please bring me dried chamomile and linden flowers from the still room, and a little honey." "What is that for?" Isolde demanded. "Are you going to poison the child with some peasant concoction?" Ilara finally turned to her, her patience gone. "It is a simple tisane to help soothe her and bring down the fever, Lady Isolde. It is what my mother always used. Now, if you are not going to help, I suggest you leave. Your panic is not helping Lillian," Isolde gasped, outraged. She looked to Alistair for support. "Alistair, are you going to allow this person to speak to me in such a manner, to experiment on your daughter?" Alistair's gaze was fixed on Ilara. He saw her competence, her quiet authority, her genuine, unwavering concern for his child. He saw the way Lillian, even in her feverish state, seemed to lean unconsciously toward Ilara's gentle touch, and he contrasted it with Isolde's noisy, self-serving drama. "Isolde," he said, his voice low and hard as iron, "be quiet, or leave." The command was absolute. Isolde stared at him, her mouth agape, before turning on her heel and storming out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Alistair did not leave. He stood by the fireplace, a silent, grim sentinel, and watched as Ilara cared for his daughter. He watched as she coaxed the warm, sweet-smelling tea between Lillian's lips. He watched as she sat by the bed for hours, never leaving, her presence a calm and reassuring constant. The village doctor finally arrived just before dawn and confirmed that it was a severe fever, but that Ilara's gentle ministrations had been exactly the right course of action. He left a tonic and instructions to continue as she had been. For 2 days and 2 nights, Ilara did not leave the nursery. She dozed in a chair by the bedside, waking at the slightest sound. Alistair came and went, his face etched with worry, but he did not interfere. He simply watched her, his silence no longer cold but filled with a dawning, grudging respect. He saw her not as the woman he had hired, but as a woman who cared for his daughter with a fierce, maternal devotion that had nothing to do with contracts or duty. She was fighting for Lillian. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. Ilara was smoothing the damp hair from Lillian's forehead when the child's eyes fluttered open. They were clear. The flush was gone from her cheeks. "Ilara," she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm here, darling," Ilara murmured, her heart swelling with relief. Lillian smiled, a faint, sleepy smile, and drifted back to sleep. Ilara felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, startled, into Alistair's grey eyes. They were no longer empty. They were filled with a profound, raw emotion she could not name. Gratitude, relief, something more. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words were quiet, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken sentences. He had placed his trust in her, and she had not failed. In the shared crisis, in the crucible of a child's illness, they had become, for the first time, allies. The aftermath of Lillian's recovery was a house transformed. The atmosphere, once thick with tension, was now quiet and still, but it was the stillness of peace, not of dread. Lady Isolde, stripped of her authority and unable to regain her footing in the new dynamic, departed in a cloud of resentful silence a few days later. No one was sorry to see her go. Lillian, now fully recovered, clung to Ilara with a fierce devotion. The last vestiges of her solemnity had been washed away by the fever, replaced by an open, trusting affection. She would hold Ilara's hand as they walked, and chatter incessantly about her small world. The sound of her laughter began to echo in the long, quiet corridors. The change in Alistair was more profound and more subtle. The wall of ice around him had not so much melted as fractured, revealing the man beneath. The silent dinners were no more. He began to speak to her, asking about her day, about her progress in the conservatory. He would listen, truly listen to her answers, his head tilted slightly, his gaze direct and focused. He started to join her and Lillian in the conservatory for a short while each afternoon, watching them work, a small, almost smile touching his lips as he observed his daughter's newfound joy. But the shadows still clung to him. The west wing remained closed. The portrait of Eleonora still dominated the gallery. The grief was a part of him, a landscape he still inhabited, even if he was slowly, tentatively, beginning to look for a way out. The catalyst for the final collapse of his defenses came from an unexpected quarter. One rainy afternoon, Lillian, who had been playing hide-and-seek with Elara, darted down a corridor she had never explored before. She skidded to a halt before the velvet rope that barred the way to the west wing. "What's this?" she asked, her voice filled with childish curiosity. Before Elara could answer, a voice, sharp and cold, cut through the air. "Lillian, step away from there." Alistair stood at the far end of the corridor, his face a thunderous mask. He had never used that tone with his daughter before. Lillian flinched as if struck, her face crumpling in fear and confusion. "Do not ever go near that rope again. Do you understand?" he said, his voice dangerously low. Tears welled in the little girl's eyes. She ran to Elara and buried her face in her skirts, her small body trembling. Elara wrapped her arms around the child, glaring at Alistair over her head. "She meant no harm," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "She was only playing. There is no need to frighten her." Alistair's face was ashen. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a look of such profound pain that it made Elara's breath catch. He looked from his terrified daughter to the velvet rope, and it was as if a ghost had risen before him. Without another word, he turned and strode away, disappearing into his study. The slam of the door echoed through the house like a gunshot. Later that evening, a storm broke over Blackwood Manor. Rain lashed against the windows and wind howled in the chimneys, a wild elemental grief that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside the house. Elara sat in the library, a book lying unread in her lap, unable to shake the image of Alistair's face. She had seen beyond the cold duke, beyond the grieving widower, and had glimpsed a man tormented by something far darker than she had ever imagined. The library door opened. Alistair stood there, his hair disheveled, his coat unbuttoned. He looked as if he had been wrestling with demons and had lost. "May I join you?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, her heart pounding. He walked to the fireplace and stood before it, staring into the flames. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of the storm outside and the crackle of the fire within. "I owe you an apology," he said at last, his back still to her. "And Lillian, I should not have. I lost my composure." "What is in that wing, Alistair?" she asked softly, using his given name for the first time. He flinched but did not turn. "Memories," he said, his voice thick. "Poisonous ones." He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were raw with a pain that was 4 years old, but as fresh as a new wound. "You think you know what happened to my wife," he said. "Everyone does. The beautiful Duchess of Blackwood, taken by a sudden illness, a tragedy. It is a lie, a carefully constructed lie I have maintained for 4 years." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Eleonora did not die of a fever. She took her own life, in her bedroom, in the West Wing." The confession fell into the room, a terrible, heavy thing. Elara stared at him, her mind reeling. Suicide, the ultimate act of despair. The whispers, the closed wing, his impenetrable grief, it all snapped into a horrific new focus. "She was not the saint everyone believes her to be," he continued, his voice ragged. "Not because she was a bad person, she was not. She was fragile, like a piece of fine porcelain, and I, with my name, my title, my world, I shattered her." He began to pace before the fire, the words pouring out of him now, a torrent held back for too long. "She hated it here. She hated the title, Duchess of Blackwood. It was a weight she could not bear. She felt trapped, scrutinized. She believed she was a failure because she had given me a daughter, not a son and heir. Every polite smile was a mask, every social event an ordeal. I saw her fading, retreating into a world of melancholy I could not penetrate. I tried. God, I tried. But I didn't know how. I thought if I gave her space, if I did not pressure her, she would find her way back. I was wrong. I was a fool." His voice broke. "The morning I found her, she had left a note. It said she was sorry that she was not strong enough to be what I needed, what the world demanded. She wrote that the title was a curse, and she was setting me free from it." He stopped pacing and looked at Elara, his face a landscape of guilt and self-loathing. "Do you understand now? When I met you, when I made my cruel, unforgivable proposal, I was not trying to punish you. I was trying to protect you. I saw what the title of Duchess had done to Eleonora. I believed it was poison. I swore I would never inflict it on another woman, keeping it from you. It was a penance, my way of honoring her, of ensuring her tragedy would never be repeated. I built these walls around my heart, closed off that wing, and locked myself away with my guilt. I thought it was the only way. Ilara rose from her chair and went to him. She did not touch him, not yet. She simply stood before him, her heart aching with a compassion so vast it almost overwhelmed her. She finally understood. His coldness was not a weapon, it was a shield. His cruelty had been a twisted, misguided act of protection. All this time she had thought he was mourning a lost love, but he was mourning his own failure to save the woman he had loved, and he was consumed by the belief that their very station in life had been the weapon. "You are not to blame," she whispered. He shook his head, a bitter, broken gesture. "I put the cage around the bird. It does not matter that I did not intend for it to die." "Look at me, Alistair," she said, her voice firm but gentle. He slowly raised his head, his grey eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Eleonora's sadness was her own. You loved her. You tried to help her. It was not the title that was the curse. It was the loneliness. It was the silence. It was the feeling that she had to be perfect. That is the cage." She reached out then and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath the fabric of his coat. "You cannot honor her memory by turning this house into a tomb. You cannot protect me by treating me like a stranger. Life is meant to be lived, not endured. Look at what has happened in the conservatory. You let the light in, and things began to grow again. It is the same with people." He stared down at her hand on his arm, and then his gaze moved up to her face. He saw not pity in her eyes, but a profound and unwavering understanding. He saw strength. He saw a compassion that did not judge, but sought to heal. For 4 years, he had been utterly alone with his guilt, and now, in the heart of the storm, this quiet, resilient woman was offering him not absolution, but companionship. A single tear tracked its way through the dust of his grief and slid down his cheek. He covered her hand with his own, his grip tight, desperate. The touch was an anchor, the first solid thing he had felt in years. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not the solution to his practical problems, but the woman who had patiently tended his neglected child, who had brought life back to his dead garden, and who was now, impossibly, offering to tend to the ruins of his own heart. He leaned in, slowly, tentatively, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of profound, aching release. It tasted of salt and rain and 4 years of unspeakable sorrow. It was the breaking of a vow of silence, the collapse of a fortress, the first tentative step out of the shadows and into the light. In that moment, the storm outside seemed to quiet, its fury spent, leaving only the soft, steady rhythm of the rain, like a heart beginning to beat again. The house awoke to a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale, luminous blue and air that smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. The change within Blackwood Manor was just as palpable. It was as if a spell had been broken. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a quiet warmth that seemed to emanate from its very stones. The morning after the revelation, Ilara found Alistair waiting for her in the breakfast room. He had never joined her for breakfast before. He rose as she entered, a gesture of courtesy she had never received from him, and pulled out her chair. The look he gave her was filled with a fragile, hesitant hope. They began to talk. Truly talk. He told her about his childhood, his solitary upbringing. She told him about Thorncroft, about her mother's love for books and flowers. They spoke of Lillian, of her future. They were two strangers, married for months, who were only just beginning to know each other. Each conversation was a thread, weaving them together, creating a new tapestry to cover the old sorrow-stained one. A week later, Alistair did something that sent a tremor of shock through the entire household. He walked to the velvet rope that barred the entrance to the west wing, untied it, and let it fall to the floor. Then he held out his hand to Ilara. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. Her fingers curled around his. His hand was warm and strong. Together they walked down the dusty corridor, and he opened the door to what had been Eleonora's rooms. The air inside was stale and thick with the scent of dried potpourri and sorrow. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, plunging the rooms into a perpetual twilight. Everything was just as it had been left 4 years ago. A silver-backed brush lay on the dressing table. A book lay open on a chaise longue, its page marked with a faded ribbon. It was a shrine, perfectly preserved. Alistair did not speak. He simply led her to the windows, and one by one he pulled back the heavy drapes. Sunlight, bright and uncompromising, flooded the rooms, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was not an act of erasure, but of acceptance, of letting the light in. "We will have the rooms cleared," he said, his voice steady. "Cleaned. We will make them new again." He looked at her. "For guests, or perhaps one day for a nursery." The implication hung in the sunlit air between them, a promise of a future they could build together. Their days found a new rhythm, one built around the small, ordinary moments of a shared life. They would walk the grounds together after breakfast, their shoulders sometimes brushing. He would read in the library in the evenings, while she did her needlepoint, the companionable silence a world away from the oppressive void that had once defined their time together. Most importantly, they became a family, the three of them, Alistair, Ilara, and Lillian, spent their afternoons in the conservatory. It had become the vibrant, beating heart of the house. It was now a riot of color and life. Roses climbed the ironwork, jasmine scented the air, and benches were laden with geraniums, fuchsias, and all the common flowers Isolde had so despised. It was a testament to Ilara's patient, nurturing love. Alistair would sit with Lillian on his lap, reading to her, his deep voice a gentle rumble. He was learning to be a father again, shedding the skin of the remote, forbidding Duke and rediscovering the man who could laugh when his daughter pointed out a funny-shaped cloud, or who could listen with rapt attention to her rambling stories. He watched Ilara, a constant quiet wonder in his eyes, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was real. He saw the way she moved among her plants, the way she smiled at his daughter, the way she had so effortlessly and completely healed his broken world. One sun-drenched afternoon, they were standing by the old camellia bush, which was now covered in a profusion of white and pale pink blossoms. Lillian was chasing a butterfly nearby, her laughter echoing in the glass house. Alistair reached out and took Ilara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I have been a fool, Ilara," he said, his voice low and earnest. "A blind, stubborn fool." He turned to face her, his grey eyes clear and filled with a love that took her breath away. "I was so wrong. I thought the title was a curse, that this life was a cage. But I was the one who built the cage, with my grief and my guilt. You walked into it and you didn't try to break the bars. You simply planted a garden inside it. You have brought life and light back, not just to this house, but to me, to my daughter." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "I love you, Ilara. I love your strength, your quiet compassion, your gentle heart. I love you more than I have words to express." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. "And I love you, Alistair," she whispered. "Then be my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not in name only, not as a functionary or a caretaker. Be my wife in truth, in every way. Let the world know you for what you are, my partner, my heart, my Duchess." The word, once a symbol of everything she was denied, now sounded like a song. It was not about status or privilege. It was about acceptance, about partnership, about love, finally and freely given. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with happy tears. "Yes, I will." He pulled her into his arms, and this time his kiss was not of sorrow and release, but of joy and promise. It was a kiss that sealed the end of one life and the beginning of another, a kiss that smelled of flowers and sunlight, a kiss that promised 1,000 more just like it. A few months later, the invitations went out. The Duke of Blackwood was hosting a grand ball, the first since his mourning had begun. It was a signal to society that the Black Duke was re-entering the world. The whispers were rampant. Who was this quiet, untitled wife he had kept hidden away in the north? What was the meaning of this sudden re-emergence? The night of the ball, Blackwood Manor was ablaze with light. For the first time, Ilara saw it not as a fortress, but as a home, alive and vibrant. Music drifted from the ballroom, and the great hall was filled with the murmur of conversation and the rustle of silk. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand on Alistair's arm, her heart thrumming with a nervous excitement. She wore a gown of deep sapphire velvet that matched her eyes, and at her throat was a diamond necklace that glittered like starlight. Alistair's wedding gift, he had called it. A new one. He squeezed her hand. "Ready?" he murmured, his eyes smiling down at her. She smiled back, a radiant, confident smile. "Ready?" Together they descended the staircase. A hush fell over the assembled guests. Every eye was on them, on the formidable Duke and the unknown woman at his side. Ilara could feel their curiosity, their judgment, but it didn't matter. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting the crowd without fear. She was not the penniless girl who had accepted a cold bargain. She was a woman who was loved, who had built a family from the ashes of grief. Alistair led her through the crowd, his hand a warm, steady presence at the small of her back. He did not lead her to the dance floor. Instead, he led her toward the tall French doors. that opened onto the grand balcony overlooking the ballroom. He stepped out onto the balcony, drawing her with him so that they stood in full view of everyone. A footman handed him a glass of champagne. He took it but did not drink. He raised the glass, and the entire ballroom fell silent, waiting. He looked out over the sea of faces, his expression calm and commanding. But then he turned his gaze to Ilara, and his face softened, his love for her shining in his eyes for all the world to see. "My friends," he began, his voice ringing with a newfound warmth and clarity that carried to every corner of the vast room. "Thank you for joining us tonight. For 4 years, this house has been a place of shadow, of memory. Tonight, we let the light back in." He paused, and his grip on her hand tightened. "I know there has been much speculation, many questions. Allow me to answer them now." He turned his body fully towards her, taking both of her hands in his. He was no longer speaking to the crowd, but only to her. "When I married this woman," he said, his voice filled with a deep, resonant emotion, "I gave her my name, but I, in my ignorance and my grief, withheld from her the honor that should have been hers, an honor she has earned not by title or by birth, but through her boundless compassion, her unwavering strength, and her incredible heart. She has healed this family. She has remade my world." He then turned back to the stunned, silent assembly. He raised his glass high, a triumphant, definitive gesture. The words he spoke next were not a toast but a proclamation, a coronation. "I give you," he declared, his voice ringing with pride and with love, "Ilara Vance, the Duchess of Blackwood." A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a wave of stunned murmurs. But Ilara heard nothing but his voice. She looked up at her husband, her duke, her Alistair, and saw in his eyes the end of her long journey. He had not just given her a title, he had given her his whole heart, publicly and unconditionally. He had stood before the world and proclaimed her his equal, his partner, his everything. As the orchestra swelled and the first couples began to move onto the dance floor, he pulled her into his arms. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" he murmured, a teasing, loving light in his eyes. "You may, Your Grace," she whispered back, and as he swept her into a waltz, spinning her around the balcony under the light of 1,000 candles, Ilara knew she was finally, truly home, not in the stones of Blackwood Manor, but in the arms of the man who had found his way back from the cold, and who had in turn given her a love greater than she had ever dared to imagine. The gardens would bloom, season after season, and so would they. Dear listener, how often do we build walls around our hearts, believing we are protecting ourselves, or even others, from pain? Like the Duke of Blackwood, we can become prisoners of our own past, living in cold, silent rooms of our own making, convinced that the things that hurt us once will hurt us again. We lock away our grief, our guilt, our fear, and in doing so, we lock out the possibility of new light, new growth. Ilara's story is a quiet testament to the profound power of patient, compassionate love. She did not arrive with a battering ram to tear down the Duke's walls. She arrived with seeds. She found the most neglected, forgotten part of his world, the derelict conservatory of his heart, and she simply began to tend to it. She cleared away the dead things, let in the sun, and nurtured the small, resilient signs of life. She showed him through her gentle actions that healing isn't about forgetting the past, but about allowing a new future to grow alongside it. Perhaps there is a neglected garden in your own life, or in the life of someone you care about, a place that seems barren and beyond hope. Remember that the grandest gestures are not always the most effective. Sometimes the most transformative act is the quiet, consistent work of showing up, of tending to the small things, of offering a little light and warmth where there has only been shadow. It is in these small acts of faith and cultivation that the most beautiful blossoms of connection, healing, and love can finally, against all odds, begin to bloom. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring. Your support allows us to continue bringing stories like this to life. Until next time.